Dungeons of Sundaria is kind of like one of my dream games. I've always wanted an over-the-shoulder dungeon crawler with a loot system similar to Diablo. And that's exactly what this game is. And at the moment that I'm doing this review, I've actually clocked in about 16 hours. So what do I think about the game? And do I recommend it? That is kind of subjective. It really depends if numbers going up is simple enough to make you enjoy a video game, in which case this will do that. Same with if you want to hunt for rare items, this will also satiate that. The problem is that a lot of the late game items are going to look and act similarly to the early game items, just their stats are going to be increased. There's no end game armor that makes you look like a total badass or anything. You're still going to be wearing the same cape and garbage that you got at the beginning. On top of that, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is the fact that this game is very jank. And that is something that is going to be a bust for a lot of people. Playing this game with friends can definitely alleviate that. And if you end up finding a class that you enjoy, that can also lead to more enjoyment, because some of the classes just outright don't work. And 80% of the levels also don't work. So let's talk about how the game is structured. Essentially, there's going to end up being the town area where you do all of your crafting and bank sorting between characters and junk like that. And then there's going to end up being a handful of levels that you can end up repeating over and over at higher difficulties as you get stronger. Each of these levels is going to have multiple unique bosses, although most of them will end up playing very similar to one another. Some of them are quite unique. Despite this game's jank, I still appreciated the variety of not only the environments, but the enemies. The only issue is that there's like maybe 1 or 2 levels that don't have either a huge difficulty spike with either a cheap boss or enemies, or the environment is just flat out broken, having you either fall out of the map or requiring you to do super precise parkour in a game that does not have good parkour. Which is why most of the footage that you guys are seeing is me running the crypt, because that's pretty much the only level that seems to be fully fleshed out. Now, that said, you can still play through all of the other levels, but there was always something that came up that halted my enjoyment of every other map except for the crypt. The other thing too that I do find commendable with this game is the fact that even though it is really janky, it's actually borrowing a lot of really smart systems from other games. So for example, you could go through a dungeon, fight the boss at the end, and maybe you get a set piece of like his special armor, right? Or maybe you don't, but you'll get fragments, which will allow you to eventually craft the set piece. On top of that, at any point, you can just warp back to town and continue your progress in any of the levels from where you went to town. So you could go halfway through the crypt, warp to town, go to the swamp biome and get halfway through that, warp to town, and then just go back to the crypt halfway through, which will really help when you start feeling burnt out in one area or another. Now, again, do I recommend this game? YESN'T, because if you are curious enough about this game from this review, maybe you should try the game out. You can always buy it, try it, refund, repeat, or maybe you'll enjoy it as much as I did. The game is pretty cheap. It's about like 10-15 bucks. So it's, you know, I got my enjoyment out of it. But as far as a rating is concerned, I'd probably honestly give this a 1 or a 2. Honestly, I don't think that the jankiness of this game is ever going to go away. But if it did, this is actually a really solid title. Even despite my low rating and the fact that this game is barely functional, there's so much heart poured into it that really stood out to me and my friends.